I still remember the exact moment my daughter's fiancé looked at me, smiled, and called me a local homeless person in front of a room full of people who chose to laugh instead of speak. What hurt the most was not the insult, it was the silence that followed, especially from the one person I thought would stand beside me. In that moment, something inside me shifted. I did not argue. I did not defend myself. I simply decided that if they believed I was nothing, then it was time to show them exactly who I was. Before we dive into today's story, take a moment to share where you're watching from. We love seeing how our stories bring people together from every corner of the world. Your thoughts and comments are what make this community so special, and we're truly grateful to have you here. If you haven't already, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story filled with drama, resilience, and unexpected twists. Now, settle in, get comfortable, and maybe grab your favorite drink because this is a tale you won't want to miss. Let's get started. My name is Margaret Dawson, but most people have called me Maggie for as long as I can remember. I am 58 years old, retired, and living in a modest house just outside Seattle, Washington. From the outside, there is nothing particularly remarkable about my life now. I wake up early, brew my coffee the same way I have for years, and sit by the kitchen window watching the light creep slowly across the yard. The routine is steady, predictable, and quiet. My neighbors probably think I am just another older woman settling into retirement. I wear practical clothes, nothing new or fashionable, and I drive a sedan that has seen better days. I tend my small garden myself, trimming rose bushes and pulling weeds without much thought. There is comfort in repetition. There is safety in being overlooked. What they do not see is the life I lived before all this. For more than 25 years, I worked as a forensic financial auditor for the Internal Revenue Service. My job was to find what people tried to hide. I traced money through layers of transactions, uncovered shell corporations designed to obscure ownership, and built cases that could withstand the most aggressive legal defenses. It was not glamorous work, but it required patience, discipline, and a certain way of seeing the world. Patterns reveal themselves if you are willing to look long enough. That way of thinking never really leaves you. I raised my daughter, Emily, mostly on my own. Her father left when she was young, and from that point forward, it was just the two of us. I worked long hours, often late into the night, but I made sure she never felt the absence. I attended every school event I could manage, helped with homework at the kitchen table, and saved carefully so she would have opportunities I never did. Everything I built with her in mind. Emily grew into exactly the kind of woman I had hoped she would become. She is smart, driven, and confident in ways I never was at her age. She works in marketing for a technology company and lives in a part of the city where everything looks polished and new. Her world moves faster than mine ever did. Somewhere along the way, though, a distance formed between us. It was not sudden. It happened gradually, in small ways that were easy to ignore at first. Phone calls became shorter. Visits became less frequent. When we did spend time together, there was always a subtle tension, like she was aware of how different our lives looked side by side. I told myself it was natural. Children grow up. They move into new spaces. They build lives that do not always include you the way they once did. Still, I noticed. The call came on a Tuesday morning while I was trimming the roses in the front yard. I remember wiping my hands on my jeans before answering, already sensing something significant in the way her name appeared on my phone. "Mom, I have news," she said, her voice bright but uneven. She told me she was engaged. His name was Ethan Caldwell. He owned a financial technology startup, something involving digital investments and automated portfolio systems. She described him as brilliant, ambitious, and well-connected. His family, she added, had deep roots in the business community around Seattle. I listened carefully, letting her speak, asking only a few questions. Years of interviewing witnesses had taught me that people reveal more when you do not interrupt them. When she finished, I told her I was happy for her, and I meant it. But as I stood there in the quiet of my yard, phone still in my hand, a familiar instinct settled in the back of my mind. It was not fear exactly, it was recognition. I had spent most of my life studying what people chose not to say, and something about this felt incomplete. If you're still watching and starting to sense that something isn't quite right beneath the surface, comment number 1 below to let me know you're with me. Now, let's move on to what really started to reveal the truth. I did not rush to meet Ethan Caldwell. I gave myself 2 days after Emily's call, not because I was busy, but because I wanted to observe my own reaction without interference. Unease has a way of sharpening if you let it sit long enough. By the time we agreed on dinner, I already knew I would not be walking into that restaurant unprepared. He chose the place. That alone told me something. The restaurant sat along the waterfront, all glass walls and polished wood, the kind of place where every detail is curated to suggest quiet wealth. The lighting was soft, the music low, and the staff moved with the kind of efficiency that comes from dealing with people who expect perfection. I arrived a few minutes early, as I always did, and stood for a moment just inside the entrance, letting my eyes adjust. I wore what I always wore, a simple navy blazer, pressed slacks, and shoes that had been resoled more than once. Nothing about me was designed to impress anyone. That had never been the point. Emily waved when she saw me, her smile quick, almost relieved. Ethan stood beside her, already watching me before I reached the table. His gaze moved over me in a single, practiced sweep, from my shoulders down to my shoes and back again. It lasted less than a second, but it was enough. He had already made a decision. His handshake was firm but brief, the kind people use when they want to appear polite without offering anything genuine. He gestured for me to sit, positioning himself beside Emily so they faced me together. It was a subtle arrangement, but not accidental. The conversation began easily enough. Emily filled the space with updates about her work, about the wedding ideas she had already started collecting, about how busy everything had become. Ethan listened with a faint smile, occasionally adding a comment that shifted the focus back toward him. He spoke about his company, about investors, about growth projections that sounded impressive even without context. I listened. Then, at a moment that felt almost too smooth to be spontaneous, he leaned back slightly and glanced at me again. There was a pause, just long enough to draw attention without making it obvious. "I thought Emily said her mom lived nearby," he said lightly. "Not on the street." The words settled over the table like a thin layer of frost. No one laughed out loud, but something in the air shifted. It was framed as a joke, the kind that allows the speaker to retreat if challenged. But I had spent too many years listening to people disguise intent behind tone. This was not careless. It was deliberate. Emily's reaction came a second too late. She smiled, then looked down at the menu, flipping a page that did not need flipping. She did not correct him. She did not say my name. She redirected. The conversation moved on, but the pattern had already been established. Ethan spoke with increasing confidence, describing his business in terms that emphasized scale and influence. He mentioned numbers often, always in a way that suggested authority. When I spoke, he listened with polite patience, then steered the discussion elsewhere before it could settle. Emily followed his lead without realizing it, her body angled toward him, her attention anchored to his words. When I began a sentence, she occasionally interrupted, not out of rudeness, but out of habit, formed somewhere I had not been present to witness. I said very little after that. Instead, I watched. There is a moment in any investigation when observation shifts into recognition. It is not dramatic. It is quiet, almost clinical. Pieces align, patterns emerge, and what once felt uncertain becomes clear. By the time dinner ended, I understood something important. The comment had not been about my clothes. It had been about position, and Ethan Caldwell had already decided where he believed I belonged. If you're still watching and felt that moment hit harder than expected, comment number 2 below so I know you're paying attention. Now, let's see how things began to shift in ways no one could ignore. I did not hear from Emily for 3 days after the dinner. That was not unusual on the surface, but the silence carried a different weight now. Before, I would have filled that space with excuses for her, telling myself she was busy, that her life had simply expanded in ways mine had not. This time, I let the quiet sit without explanation. When the call finally came, it arrived mid-morning while I was at the kitchen table reviewing an old financial journal out of habit, more than necessity. Her name appeared on my phone, and for a moment, I simply looked at it before answering. Her voice was bright, almost too carefully arranged. There was excitement there, but it felt structured, like something she had practiced before dialing. She moved quickly through the opening, announcing decisions rather than sharing them. The wedding had been scheduled. The venue was a private resort just outside Seattle, one known for hosting corporate retreats and high-end events. Everything, she explained, would be handled by Ethan's family. The planning, the coordination, the expenses. She emphasized that last part more than once, as if it were the most important detail. I listened without interrupting. As she continued, the structure of it all began to take shape. The guest list was described as intimate, which in practice meant controlled. Space was limited, she said, and Ethan's family had a large network of relatives and business associates. There would not be room for everyone. She did not need to say it directly. I understood what was being removed. The people who had known Emily since she was a child would not be there. The neighbors who had watched her grow up, the few friends I still kept in touch with from earlier years, even extended family on my side. They did not fit within the version of the event being constructed. I noticed the language she used. It did not sound like her. It was precise, almost rehearsed, filled with phrases that prioritized logistics over sentiment. I had heard that tone before, in conference rooms where decisions were presented as inevitable rather than negotiable. When I asked a simple question about the guest list, she answered quickly, then moved on before the conversation could settle. It was not avoidance in the obvious sense. It was redirection. Then came the part that clarified everything. She mentioned the overall aesthetic of the wedding. The photographs, she said, needed to feel cohesive, clean, elegant. There was a pause, brief but deliberate, before she added that it might be best if I chose something understated to wear, something that would not draw attention or disrupt the visual balance. I held the phone in my hand and said nothing. The words themselves were mild, reasonable even, if taken at face value, but meaning rarely exists only on the surface. In my years of work, I learned that what people suggest is often more revealing than what they demand. This was not about clothing. It was about presence. I could feel the shift happening inside me, not sudden, but precise. The discomfort from the dinner settled into something more defined. This was not a series of isolated moments. It was a structure, carefully assembled, where every decision served the same purpose: to place me at the edge. When the call ended, the house felt quieter than before. I remained at the table, my hands resting on the wood, listening to the stillness settle around me. I thought about Ethan's comment at the restaurant, the way he had delivered it without hesitation, the way Emily had absorbed it without resistance. Patterns do not announce themselves. They reveal through repetition. And now, for the first time, I allowed the thought to form completely. This was not just arrogance. This was control. And control, when applied consistently, always serves a larger purpose. If you're still watching and beginning to see the pattern forming, comment number 3 below to stay with me. Now, let's uncover what was hiding just beneath everything. The shift did not feel dramatic. It never does. One moment, I was a mother trying to understand her daughter's choices. The next, I was something else entirely, someone I had not needed to be in a long time. I cleared the kitchen table that afternoon, moving aside the unopened mail and the book I had been pretending to read. My laptop sat where it always did, closed but never far from reach. For years, it had been a tool of routine. Now, it became something sharper. I started with the obvious. Ethan Caldwell's company was easy to find. It had a polished website, the kind designed to impress investors and reassure clients. Clean lines, confident language, and carefully selected testimonials filled the screen. The company described itself as a financial technology platform specializing in automated investment strategies, promising efficiency, growth, and innovation. Everything about it suggested forward motion. At first glance, it was convincing. But I had learned long ago that surface clarity often hides structural weakness. I began reading more slowly, paying attention not just to what was said, but to what was missing. The descriptions were broad, impressive without being specific. Terms like optimized returns and dynamic allocation appeared repeatedly, but without supporting detail. It was language meant to create confidence, not transparency. I opened a second tab and began searching public records. Business registrations came first. The company was officially incorporated in Washington, with Ethan listed as founder and primary officer. The filing dates aligned with what he had said at dinner, but the growth timeline felt compressed. According to public announcements, the company's valuation had increased rapidly over a short period. That was not impossible, but it was uncommon without a clear revenue trail. I continued. Investor releases, partnership claims, and expansion plans appeared across various platforms. Each one reinforced the same narrative of success. Yet when I looked for underlying financial data, there was very little available. No detailed disclosures, no breakdown of revenue streams, no clear explanation of how the growth was being sustained. It was not proof of wrongdoing. But it was enough to raise questions. I began tracing associated entities, following the names of partner firms and affiliated companies mentioned in press releases. It was a habit I had never lost, mapping connections, building a structure piece by piece. Some of the names led nowhere. Others circled back in ways that felt too convenient, like a system designed to appear expansive while remaining internally contained. Then I saw it. One name, buried in a secondary filing, triggered something I had not expected. It was not immediately obvious why. I had to sit with it for a moment, letting memory catch up with recognition. I had seen that company before. Years ago, near the end of my career, it had appeared in an investigation involving layered transactions and questionable asset transfers. The case had been complex, difficult to prove, and ultimately closed before we could establish a clear violation. There had been pressure to move on, to redirect resources elsewhere. I remembered the frustration of leaving it unfinished. Now that same name was connected, however indirectly, to Ethan's network. I leaned back in my chair, hands resting lightly on the edge of the table. The house was quiet, the kind of silence that makes even small realizations feel heavier. This was no longer just about a man who lacked respect. There was a pattern here, faint but familiar, stretching backward into something I had once tried to understand. I did not have evidence, not yet. But experience had taught me something simple. If something is hidden well enough, it does not disappear. It leaves traces. If you're still watching and realizing this is much bigger than it first seemed, comment number 4 below to let me know you're locked in. Now it's time for everything to come to the surface. The day of the wedding arrived with the kind of quiet precision that always accompanies events designed to appear effortless. I drove out of Seattle just after noon, the road stretching ahead in long, clean lines. The venue sat beyond the city limits, surrounded by carefully maintained land that signaled exclusivity without ever needing to announce it. I parked where I was directed, handed over my keys, and stepped into a space that had already decided what role I would play in it. Everything was arranged to perfection. White structures, soft music, and guests dressed in muted elegance created an atmosphere that felt less like a celebration and more like a performance. I moved through it without hesitation, aware of the brief glances that followed me, the quiet assessments made in passing. None of it was new. I had seen this kind of social sorting before, just in different forms. My seat was not difficult to find. It was positioned near the edge of the ceremony space, close enough to see, far enough to be peripheral. I sat without comment, hands folded lightly in my lap, and waited. When Emily appeared, she looked exactly as she should have, composed, radiant, and entirely aligned with the world she had stepped into. For a moment, everything else receded. I saw only my daughter, walking forward with a confidence I had helped build. That was still real, even now. The ceremony passed without incident. Words were spoken, vows exchanged, and applause followed. It was seamless, controlled, and efficient. By the time we moved into the reception, the energy had shifted. Music grew louder, conversations loosened, and the careful balance of the room began to soften under the influence of celebration. I watched. Ethan moved easily through the crowd, his presence expanding as the evening progressed. He spoke with investors, with family, with anyone who carried weight in that room. At one point, as I stood near the edge of the reception hall, I heard him mention an upcoming deal. The numbers were not stated outright, but the tone was clear. Something significant was approaching, something that would elevate his company further. It fit the pattern I had already begun to see. Later, as the evening settled into a rhythm of speeches and laughter, the moment came. I heard my name before I understood the context. Ethan's voice carried farther than he intended, sharpened by alcohol and confidence. He gestured loosely in my direction, his expression amused in a way that invited agreement. He referred to me as a local homeless person. The words moved through the room quickly, not loudly, but effectively. A few people laughed. Others looked away, choosing distance over discomfort. His family did not react at all, which in some ways said more than laughter would have. I looked toward Emily. She heard it. I could see it in the way her posture shifted, in the brief hesitation before she turned her head, but she did not step forward. She did not speak. She redirected her attention elsewhere, as if the moment could be dissolved by ignoring it. Something settled inside me then, not anger, not even hurt in its sharpest form. It was clarity. I stood. The movement itself drew attention. Conversations quieted slightly as I walked across the room, my steps measured, unhurried. The microphone stood near the center, unattended between scheduled speeches. I reached it without obstruction. I did not raise my voice. I spoke the way I always had when it mattered, steady and deliberate, allowing silence to do most of the work. I spoke about value, about how it is measured not in numbers or appearances, but in how people treat those who offer them nothing in return. I spoke about integrity, about the difference between success and substance. I did not name Ethan. I did not need to. When I finished, the room was still. Not hostile, not supportive, just suspended in a moment that no one had prepared for. I returned the microphone and walked out the way I had come. No one stopped me. As I reached the parking area and waited for my car, I understood something with complete certainty. This was not the end of anything. It was the line. I drove home in silence. The road stretched ahead of me in long, empty lines, the city lights fading gradually in the rearview mirror. I did not turn on the radio. I did not reach for distraction. The quiet gave me space to think, and thinking was something I had always trusted more than emotion. The evening replayed itself in fragments. Ethan's voice, careless and certain. The subtle shift in the room as people chose comfort over confrontation. Emily turning away, her silence more deliberate than any word she could have spoken. None of it surprised me anymore. That was the part that settled most clearly. By the time I pulled into my driveway, I was no longer reacting. I was deciding. Inside the house, everything was exactly as I had left it. The stillness felt familiar, almost grounding. I set my keys on the counter, removed my jacket, and stood for a moment in the center of the room, letting the transition complete itself. There is a difference between being hurt and being resolved. I moved to the kitchen table and opened my laptop. The habits returned immediately, not forced, not even conscious. I created folders, labeled them carefully, and began organizing what I already knew. Public records, company filings, notes from earlier searches. Each piece of information had its place. Each connection was mapped with the same precision I had used for years. I was not guessing. I was building. Ethan's company did not exist in isolation. It was supported by a network of affiliated entities, some clearly defined, others less so. I traced ownership structures, comparing registration dates, cross-referencing names that appeared across multiple filings. The pattern I had noticed before became clearer with structure: growth without transparency, expansion without a stable foundation. It was not proof, but it was direction. I began outlining potential points of concern: financial representations that could not be easily verified, revenue claims that lacked supporting documentation, entities that appeared to serve no purpose other than to move assets in controlled loops. None of it was illegal on its own. That was how these systems worked. They relied on complexity to create distance from accountability. I knew where that distance could be challenged. The Internal Revenue Service had processes for reporting irregularities. The Securities and Exchange Commission monitored disclosures tied to investment activity. Both required clarity, structure, and restraint in how information was presented. Emotion had no place in it. I kept my notes neutral, factual, precise. Still, there was one variable I could not reduce to documentation: Emily. I paused once, my hands resting on the keyboard, considering what this would mean for her. The consequences would not remain contained. They would reach her whether she understood them now or not. That was unavoidable, but so was the alternative. Allowing it to continue would not protect her. It would only delay what was already in motion. I continued typing. Near midnight, I reviewed everything I had assembled. It was not complete, but it was enough to begin, enough to move from observation into action. Before closing the laptop, I opened one final file and added a note. Ethan's company was preparing for a funding round. The timing was not accidental. If the structure held, it would bring in significant capital. If it did not, The collapse would be immediate and public. I sat back in my chair, the room quiet around me. I had spent most of my life understanding one simple principle. I do not make threats. I act. If you're still watching and feel the tension building towards something unavoidable, comment number 6 below so I know you're still here. Now, let's move on to Chapter 7, where things start to fall apart. Several days passed before anything visible changed. I did not expect immediate results. Processes like the ones I had initiated rarely moved quickly on the surface. They worked beneath it, quietly, following procedures that favored patience over speed. I had submitted the reports with the level of detail required to trigger attention. After that, there was nothing to do but wait and observe. So I returned to my routines. Mornings began with coffee at the kitchen window. Afternoons were spent tending the garden or reading, though my focus drifted more often than it settled. From the outside, nothing about my life suggested movement. Inside, I was tracking everything. The first shift was subtle. Mentions of Ethan's company began to slow, not disappear, just lose momentum. The steady stream of confident updates that had filled their public channels became less frequent, less certain. Announcements that once carried clarity now felt delayed, as if timing had become a variable rather than a certainty. I followed the changes through publicly available information, business filings, minor updates, investor commentary that appeared in fragments across financial platforms. None of it confirmed anything directly, but the pattern was familiar. Confidence weakening at the edges before it collapses at the center. A week later, the second shift appeared. The anticipated funding announcement did not arrive. There was no formal explanation, just silence where momentum had been building. In my experience, that kind of pause rarely happens without pressure behind it. Something had disrupted the sequence. I noted it, added it to the timeline I had begun constructing. What I did not expect was how quickly the response would turn toward me. It started with indirect contact. A former colleague reached out under the pretense of checking in. A neighbor mentioned hearing concerns from someone connected to Emily's circle. The language was consistent, careful, and designed to appear sympathetic. They spoke about worry, about stress, about how I seemed overly focused on something that should not matter this much. I recognized the pattern immediately. When facts begin to surface, attention shifts to the source. It is easier to question a person's stability than to address the substance of what they have found. I had seen it used countless times, a strategy designed to weaken credibility before truth has time to establish itself. I did not respond to any of it. Instead, I continued documenting what I observed, mentally organizing each reaction as part of the larger structure. Pressure was being applied, not directly, but effectively. Emily's call came late in the afternoon. Her voice carried strain, the kind that builds when confusion and frustration overlap. She did not begin with questions. She began with accusation, shaped by everything she had been told. She believed I was responsible for what was happening. I listened without interrupting, the way I always had. When she finished, I answered carefully, keeping my tone even, my words precise. I told her I had acted within my rights, that I had reported concerns based on what I had observed, nothing more. She did not accept that distinction. To her, the consequences were already personal. The company was under pressure. Ethan was reacting. Everything she had built her future around felt unstable. When the call ended, the distance between us felt more defined than ever. I sat at the table for a long time afterward, considering the path ahead. There would be more resistance, more attempts to redirect, to discredit, to contain. That was expected. What mattered was that the process had begun. And once it begins, it does not stop halfway. The pressure did not arrive all at once. It accumulated layer by layer until the weight of it became impossible to ignore. By the time I sat down at my table again to review the latest filings, I could feel the shift in direction. This was no longer just a matter of observation. Something was moving closer to the surface. I expanded my search beyond the primary entities I had already mapped. The connections I had identified earlier led outward into a wider network, one that required more careful tracing. Names repeated across different filings, sometimes clearly, sometimes buried in secondary documentation. I followed each thread methodically, building a clearer structure from what had once been scattered fragments. It was during one of those cross-references that I saw it. At first, it did not register. The name appeared in a list of authorized signatories attached to a smaller entity connected to Ethan's company. It was positioned among others, formatted no differently, easy to overlook unless you were paying attention. I read it once, then again, Emily Dawson. I did not react immediately. That was something I had trained myself out of long ago. Instead, I verified. I opened the document again, checked the filing date, compared it against other records. The name appeared consistently, tied to the same entity, associated with financial authorization that extended beyond what a casual connection would require. I leaned back slightly, allowing the information to settle. This was not incidental. Emily was not listed as an employee. She was not referenced in a marketing role or as part of the public-facing side of the business. Her name was embedded deeper, in a place where responsibility carried legal weight. I continued tracing the entity. It functioned as an intermediary, a layer that facilitated movement between accounts without drawing direct attention to the primary company. On its own, that structure was not illegal, but in the context of everything else I had seen, it fit too cleanly into the existing pattern. I reviewed the documents again, this time focusing on what Emily's involvement might mean. There was no indication she had constructed any of it. The language of the filing suggested a formal role, one likely presented to her as routine or administrative, something she could have agreed to without understanding the implications. That was how these structures often worked. They relied on trust, on proximity, on the assumption that no one would look closely enough to question it. I closed my eyes for a moment, not out of exhaustion, but to separate reaction from analysis. This changed the equation. Until now, the consequences of what I had set in motion had been external. They would affect Ethan, his company, his family. Emily had been positioned at the edge of that impact, emotionally involved, but not directly exposed. That was no longer true. If the investigation moved forward, her name would surface. It would be reviewed, examined, and potentially questioned in ways she was not prepared for. Intent would matter, but so would association. I opened a new document and began outlining her position within the structure, identifying where her exposure began and where it might end. The process felt colder than before, more deliberate. This was not just about accountability anymore. It was about containment. Outside, the afternoon light had begun to fade, casting longer shadows across the room. I barely noticed. My attention remained fixed on the screen, on the connections that had finally become visible. Emily was already inside this, and now, whether she understood it or not, I had to decide how far I was willing to go to bring everything else into the light. If you're still watching and wondering how far this will really go, comment number 8 below to stay with me. Now, let's move into the final outcome and see how everything truly ends. The first confirmation did not come from a headline. It came from absence. The company's name, once steady across financial platforms and industry discussions, began to disappear from places where it had previously dominated. Scheduled announcements failed to materialize. Investor communications shifted from confident projections to vague reassurances. It was not loud. It was quiet erosion. Then the formal indicators followed. Regulatory notices appeared in public records, subtle in wording but unmistakable in implication. Reviews had been initiated, documentation requested, timelines extended. These were the early stages, the part most people never noticed until the outcome was already decided. I tracked each development carefully, building a record of events as they unfolded. Investor withdrawals appeared next, first in small amounts, then in larger, more decisive movements. Partnerships dissolved without explanation. The anticipated funding round collapsed entirely, leaving a gap that could not be easily filled. The structure I had mapped was no longer holding. Media coverage followed soon after, restrained but precise. Reports did not accuse directly, but they asked the right questions. That was enough. In environments built on perception, uncertainty spreads faster than certainty ever can. I did not feel satisfaction. What I felt was recognition. This was what happens when pressure meets weakness. Not instant destruction, but gradual exposure. Each layer giving way to the one beneath it until nothing remains protected. The personal consequences arrived more slowly. Emily did not call this time. She came in person. I saw her car pull into the driveway late in the afternoon. I remained seated on the porch, watching as she stepped out and paused for a moment before walking toward me. There was no hesitation in her movement, but there was something else, something stripped down, unguarded. She looked different, not physically, but in the way she carried herself. The certainty that had once defined her was gone, replaced by something quieter, more uncertain. She sat beside me without speaking at first, her hands resting in her lap, her gaze fixed on the street ahead. When she finally spoke, her voice lacked the sharpness it had carried before. She told me she had not understood what she had signed, that Ethan had handled everything, that she had trusted him without question. The words came slowly, as if each one required effort. There was no anger left to express, only clarity. When she finished, I explained what I knew, not in detail that would overwhelm her, but enough to make the reality clear. The structures, the risks, the way her name had been used within a system she had never fully seen. She did not argue. She did not defend him. She nodded, absorbing each piece as it settled. Then she apologized. It was not dramatic. It was quiet, direct, and without qualification. The kind of apology that comes from understanding, not obligation. I looked at her for a long moment before responding. Forgiveness is not immediate. It does not erase what has already happened, but it can begin. We sat there together as the light shifted around us, neither of us trying to fill the silence. Behind us, everything Ethan had built was still collapsing. In front of us, something smaller, more fragile, was beginning again. Time settled differently after everything came to light. The urgency that had once defined each day faded into something quieter, more measured. Weeks passed without the constant need to monitor filings or track subtle shifts in the public records. The process had reached its natural conclusion. What remained was not movement, but aftermath. Ethan's company still existed, but only in the technical sense. The structure had been forced into compliance under scrutiny, its growth halted, its reputation permanently altered. Financial penalties had been issued, not devastating enough to destroy entirely, but significant enough to leave a mark that could not be erased. Investors had moved on. Opportunities had narrowed. The future he once described with certainty had been reduced to uncertainty. I followed the final reports when they became available, reading them once, then setting them aside. There was no satisfaction in the outcome, only confirmation. This was how things ended when truth was allowed to surface. Emily began visiting more often. At first, the visits were tentative, as if she were unsure of the ground beneath her. She would sit across from me at the kitchen table, hands folded, searching for words that did not always come easily. We did not try to return to what we had been. That version of us belonged to a time before either of us understood what the other was capable of. Instead, we spoke honestly. There was less distance now, but also fewer assumptions. She asked questions about things she had never considered before, about the work I had done, about how I had learned to see patterns where others saw nothing. I answered without turning it into a lesson. She was not a child anymore. She did not need instruction. She needed clarity. Trust does not rebuild quickly. It forms in small moments, in conversations that are not avoided, in silences that are no longer uncomfortable. I could see the effort she was making, not through grand gestures, but through consistency. That mattered more than anything she could have said. I did not pretend that everything was forgiven. There are lines that, once crossed, do not disappear. They remain, not as barriers, but as boundaries. I understood now that I would never again allow myself to be diminished for the sake of someone else's comfort. That was not anger, it was recognition. One evening, we sat together on the porch as the light faded across the street. The air was cooler, the kind that carries the quiet of approaching autumn. Emily spoke about her future, not in terms of plans tied to someone else, but in choices she would make for herself. I listened. For the first time in a long while, I did not feel the need to question what remained unsaid. The truth had already done its work. What was left between us was not what we had before. It was something clearer. And it's that, I realized, was enough. In the end, what truly matters is not how others choose to see us, but how firmly we stand in our own worth. Respect cannot be borrowed from wealth, status, or appearances. It is earned quietly, through integrity, through the choices we make when no one is watching, and through the courage to refuse being diminished by those who mistake silence for weakness. Sometimes, the truth does not arrive gently. It disrupts, it exposes, and it forces change that cannot be undone. But within that disruption lies clarity, and within that clarity, a chance to rebuild something more honest, more grounded, and more real. Thank you for being here and sharing this journey. If this story resonated with you, leave a comment and share your thoughts. Do not forget to follow and subscribe for more meaningful stories like this.